Somewhat notoriously here at Varnblog, I don't really do debates. There are a couple of times where you've seen me do public debates where I have said I will debate people with whom I share about 80% of a worldview. The most public of whom was debates actually before 2020 that I did with Sam Kangarloo and Max Seho over modern monetary theory and two slightly different versions of it. One, Max Seho was defending a version uh, that was interpreted through the lens of the work of Scott Ferguson. Sam Kimmerglue was defending one through the lens of Warren Mosler. Now, the reason why I don't do debates where we don't share enough of a worldview has a lot to do with rational assumptions that we don't share a metaphysics, that we might not share terms, and that we might have highly invested people watching who are watching us to confirm their worldview, making debate somewhat pointless. But I've been friends with Ben Burgis for a long time and somewhat famously helped promote at Zero Books his 2019 book, Give Them an Argument, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Burgis and I have different ideas about debate. Ben and I have talked about this back and forth for years. There are cases where I will debate and cases where I won't. That does not mean I will not engage. The only time I don't engage with someone is when I don't think they're representing their position honestly, or they engage in consistent dishonest tactics, of which case I don't see the point in any performative debate whatsoever, or even more formative engagements, because if they're going to dissemble or elude, why would you bother? But I do believe in dialogue with people who are profoundly different than me, to understand and map their mindset, to get them to talk about where they understand things and where they're coming from. This is not an oppositional dialectical process. This is also not something that you do just for the idea that dialogue will convert people to your point of view. It won't. I was thinking about two relatively recent YouTube videos that I've seen. One by Joe Foley over at Unsolicited Advice, who is one of these philosophy YouTubers. Not a bread tuber, more true philosophy YouTuber. And then the other by Michael Burns, where he talks about not debating or don't talk about politics, by Sarah Stein Lebrano. And I wanted to talk about this and tie this back into an understanding of what Ben was on about, and then come back to my points. I'm going to link the two videos in the show notes so you can find them, but I will summarize them for you here. According to Joe Foley, performative debate really comes from the idea of a Platonic debate, which is an idealized Socratic dialogue where participants seek only truth. Easily concede points when proven wrong, although I'm going to be honest with you, in Platonic debates, sometimes they concede points that they shouldn't concede because the dialogues aren't real, and cooperate to find contradictions in their beliefs. This became a model often assumed in the Renaissance or early modern period and into the Enlightenment for how debate was supposed to work. But modern research into both cognitive biases and understanding of informal and formal logical fallacies makes this good faith exchange not really purposeful. It's not really useful, Foley says. Now, I personally would add to Foley's diagnosis here. Debates in the Platonic dialogues were ideal dialectics. The dialogues were pedagogical tools to try to explain how you dealt with contested concepts, like the concept of love or the concept of truth or the concept of the forms, where there were not accepted definitions of which to do analytics. All right. For those of you who don't know where dialectics comes from in ancient philosophy, and we find it in the Confucian tradition, we find it in the Dharmic tradition, particularly in the works of Nagarjuna, which means that it has a strong influence in the traditions that developed in Mahayana Buddhism. And in fact, dialectical debates is literally part of the Tibetan monastic system. You find them in Hindu debates, particularly in the philosophical schools. Performative debates were big in Christianity too. Debates between Jews and Christian theologians were not uncommon. But are they really about the search for truth? And Foley outlines 3 things that you have to deal with. 1, there are incentives for winning a debate, particularly if you are doing this as part of your reputation. Error is punished as weakness because it actually does not reinforce a political or identitarian point of view. And this is doubly so when the social pressures for, say, television or YouTube are added and made it higher. 2, there's audience reinforcement pressures. Public speakers must answer pre-existing platforms and audiences and must deal with them in terms that they understand. Changing one's mind can be perceived as consorting with the enemy and motivating speakers to simply dig in their heels, which is kind of a version of cognitive bias leading to a backfire effect. And 3, there's often a complexity mismatch. Real-world issues in science and philosophy are far too sophisticated to be resolved in short, non-technical spoken windows. If you think about this, public debate has to be shallow enough for a general audience to follow and for rhetorical tricks to work, which actually prevents them from dealing with the cutting edge of any question. Then Foley actually develops this further, and he goes on to talk about Aristotle's observation that being right is insufficient to win an audience. And that's why Aristotle actually did do rhetorics, because he thought that truth alone did not defeat the sophist. Today, Foley goes on to map out how System 1 thinking, drawing on Daniel Kahneman's work, focuses on fast, intuitive, emotionally driven thinking, which is different from System 2 logic. Now, I actually have criticisms of Kahneman's work. I actually think Thinking Fast and Slow is a highly overrated text, but there is something to the idea of deliberation versus performance. And all this has to be contextualized. Who are your audience? What's your power relationship to the audience? How are you situated in a mode of production? What does this confirm? Furthermore, Foley goes on to talk about cognitive bias and confirmation bias, where people actually listen to debates piecemeal to confirm what they already believe, and the power of narrative, where humans are more easily swayed by emotive stories and anecdotes than by dry statistics and data. This is all normal scientific thinking stuff, some of which I think is actually a little bit misleading, because narrative is a way to contextualize statistics and data, but it takes a very good thinker to do that. Rhetorical skill also plays a role. And do you have a natural charisma? Are you attractive? Are you good at vocal inflection? How do you hold your body language? Do you seem confident? This is all true whether or not what the speaker is claiming to be true. Furthermore, debate as theater, particularly in the age of streamers and YouTube and Twitch and TikTok, maybe less TikTok today, and Instagram, means that the barriers to entry are low. Debate provides exposure and attempt to do audience capture. And while there is some pedagogical value, the pedagogical value often is inhibited by a need never to look foolish in a debate. Now, that's all in addition to the things I said in the beginning, where you have to deal with different conceptions of terms, where you have to parse this, that, and the other. Now, Foley ultimately says he's the debate optimist and gives some things about what debate is good for, and we'll come back to that when we talk about Ben and his original argument. This brings me to another video by Michael Burns, which is really talking about Don't Talk About Politics by Sellerstein Librato, a book that I actually really like. I might try to get Librato on my show. Debate culture is something that she says has really popped up in forums and developed into its own kind of community on YouTube and stuff being other forms of social media. in the last 10 or 15 years. She says this is fueled by several factors. One, the belief in the marketplace of ideas, a myth that if the public is continuously exposed and discusses ideas, the best and most rational ones will rise to the top on their own because of their truth value. We've already talked about the problems of that. Abrada also talks about the consumerism of thought. The reasoning has become a commerce where people purchase the right ideas rather than identifying to the best available and changing their minds accordingly, often because they are purchasing this as part of an identity, and an identity in which they act as a consumer. You have parasocial relations with the speakers or the people debating. You have a projection upon the political ideologies of which you seek, and there you go. Lebrano also talks about confirmation bias, because anyone who ever talks about debate has to talk about confirmation bias, and as both a cognitive bias where people are trying to disconfirm what gives them cognitive dissonance and confirm what confirms to their identity. Therefore, there's a tendency to only listen to the stuff that agrees with you. And then lastly, outrage, because it increases engagement on social media, is given numbers, and there's literally an algorithmic trigger to keep people engaged. If it rages, it leads. She also complains about the legitimization of insane ideas, because some ideas are given false equity, or I like to talk about sometimes it limits ideas artificially, whereas we talk about two sides and I'm picking the sides as if those are the only options. This is a way to legitimize ideas at the expense of others, but also to legitimize political ideologies by selecting what is acceptable within them. She also says that it encourages, as many liberals do, many progressive liberals do, an artificial middle ground where common sense is the only solution by splitting the difference without dealing with that a median might not even reflect this artificial center. Now, there's a reflection versus action issue that Michael Burns brings in the work of Sarah Stiley and Lobato. One, there's a trap of explanation that many left-leaning individuals in particular have a false hope that if they just explain the systems of oppression clearly enough, as Michael Burns says, people will be motivated to overthrow them. Sorry, no so work. It's also actually missing that there's a certain amount of interpolation where the people who are participating in a system, say the film industry, might make anti-capitalist movies, say, I don't know, most of them in some ways, not just to pacify anti-capitalism in any conscious way, but it does actually tie it into the very market that it's critiquing and serves as an off valve, making it seem like there's a way out of capital by participating in capital. Very contradictory position. Two, that online discussion board trick people into thinking they are thinking about ideas that might lead them to take action, where they're actually just passively consuming entertainment. And three, reflecting the world is only useful if it leads to decisions and actions that change material conditions, aka the purpose of philosophy is to understand the world, but our purpose is to change it, a la Marxist thesis on Feuerbach. Now, Lebrano and thus Burns thinks that we could embody these engagements by actually going out and doing politics in the world, not just discussing them. And that we should participate in things like protests, not because they're efficacious against whatever oppression that you're talking about. Lebrano is actually quite obvious that they're not, but that they build solidarity and can create action to politics. Now, I actually do think there's some truth to this, but we have to be careful that we don't fall into unthinking involvement that doesn't actually have any critical reflection. If theoria doesn't have a relation to praxis, and praxis doesn't have a relation to theoria, what use is either? Since we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, it becomes a way to replicate certain habits that people do in activist circles without seeing if they have any efficaciousness at all. And if we only think about things, we can feel like we're doing politics while we're sitting alone in our room, and we might just be gooning, where perhaps we should have been going outside and engaging because intelligence is a social act, as even Aristotle knew. This brings me to Ben, though. If we ask ourselves a couple questions about maybe where everything would go, Ben wrote "Given Them for Arguments" in the context of the Dirtbag Left and mocking the debate bros like Ben Shapiro, who often use very facile debating tactics, and that it would be good to not just mock them, but also to engage in logic, because a movement that only knows how to shame, call out, or diagnose unsavory motivations of opponents will fail to persuade anyone who doesn't agree with them, since the psychological diagnosis or the psychologization of one's opponent would themselves be taken as disingenuous. After all, you can't really know what's in someone's head that you're not actually engaging with. So the left needs to expropriate logic to persuade an uncommitted middle, not just mock, force their own key beliefs. Now, I actually agree with Ben on this, but I think public debate is a terrible way to do this. While Ben particularly talks about the cheap sophistry of right-wing pundits, particularly people like Ben Shapiro, I've actually always found that to be somewhat easy. After all, Shapiro is a pundit. He's not even really a right-wing thinker in any serious sense. He's a right-wing popularizer. He gives us a couple of techniques for handling this. Ben talks about using deductive validity, for example, to show that facts do not actually support conclusions, even when Shapiro's facts are true. But then he breaks this down. He then goes through to deal with right-wing classical liberal figures like Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux. Molyneux's kind of fallen out of the headway. He is someone I actually encountered myself way back in the days in the early 2000s when I was still in the right wing, and he was writing for places like LouRockwell.com. Jordan Peterson has his own thing and became a bit of a codice industry, so much so that Ben and I both once spoke at a conference in Idaho at University of Idaho in Boise to respond to a debate that did not happen between Douglas Lane and Jordan Peterson, and then which did ultimately, under pressure, lead to the combination of the Zizek-Peterson debate. Now, Ben talks about inferences to the best explanation or abduction, and he says that what passes for logic in a lot of these circles is just performative debating. The problem is, though, that is what debates are, is they're performative, and these sophistic tricks are for that. Debate is actually not a good way to engage in this kind of argumentation. And in fact, I'm watching Ben debate. He's not a bad debater, and he's done debate analysis. I've done it with him actually on a show a couple of times. I have coached debate, for those of you who don't know. It's something that I actually have done in multiple countries. He talks about, other problems using Ayn Rand's A as A statement and other particular problems. He also actually talks about the problems of Leon Trotsky's dealing with formal logic in favor of dialectical logic, but he doesn't really understand that dialectical logic is actually a part of formal logic. It's just historicized through Marx and Hegel, but as opposed to just seen as a particular debate event. But nonetheless, he talks about it in this part of this chapter. Now, he also goes after data-driven technocracy by Nate Silver, saying that statistical reasoning used by technocrats to shut down radical policy debates don't deal with the logical cases or the structural cases in those debates, and that statistical reasoning is often very facile. All true, and all things that we should consider, but does that prove Burns or Lebrano or even Foley, back in Unsolicited Advice, wrong? And I would say no, actually. The problem with performative debate is it actually encourages the very shallow arguments that Ben is rightly complaining about and Ben has dealt with many a times. I also think there's less of an uncommitted middle than he seems to think, or that the uncommitted middle tends to come from other biases that may not show up in the debate. And thus, here we are. Now, in chapter 6 of Give Them an Argument, and again, I'm very familiar with this book. I literally was one of the people who agreed to publish it over at Zero. I worked for Zero at the time and was talking to Ben. I've been talking to Ben Burgis going back to, I think, 2014. He says that collective self-education and collective self-emancipation are tied together, not in the sense that one can just teach the workers how to do logic, but that collective self-improvement and self-skilling is part of the mission of socialism. A fundamental thing I agree with. Right? That is the part of this is aimed to physically change the world, because changing the way one deals with concepts and interacts with the modes of production actually does give you a way to start thinking your way through, be committed to a program, figure out if that program is logical, achievable, possible, and what can be done with it. What is to be done is based off the idea that we know what it is and what doing means. This leads us to a kind of core set of issues. All three of these thinkers deal with the backfire effect. Burgis suggests that the backfire effect is countered by extreme clarity. If you strip the argument down to its bare logic, you make it harder for the opponent, or at least the audience, to hide behind emotional fallacies. This is only true, though, if you have the space to do it, and performative debate often does not allow that space. And I'm not even sure Ben would disagree with me. Foley argues that the background effect is always there. There's no way to actually be extremely clear for complex topics, because debates are win-lose arenas within a limited set of time, and the egos and social pressures won't allow people to concede key points even when they need to, or only do so strategically. He suggests that we should stop expecting conversion, but that a debate optimist should still do debates for exposure to both the tactics and the arguments, both that people's sophistic tactics be exposed, but that the arguments themselves are made more certain. Lebrano and Burns argue that the backfire effect is a biological certainty, because when you talk about politics, you trigger the oblongata. To change minds, you must bypass the argument entirely and build relationships based on trust and mutual interest first. Then the arguments can come, because the Abdullah oblongata will not be triggered and rational thinking in the forebrain can be dealt with. Now, I myself think that all these things are somewhat true. Debate is a medium that tends to be about win-loss and about conversion. That's why I only debate people with whom I share a majority of a worldview, because that reduces the need to perform an ideology. Two, I do think Ben's point about extreme clarity is true, but if you can't break through people's biological defense mechanisms, like reptile brain stress induced by the medulla oblongata, not by the medulla oblongata, the amygdala. I've been saying the wrong organ this entire time. The amygdala, back here, brain, all the way like back over here, base of the brain. That you will never get to the moment of extreme clarity, and it's incredibly hard to do in the context of formal debate, which Ben would no doubt concede to me because we've talked about it. Now, the other problem is that the marketplace of ideas conflict has some issues. One, Ben more or less believes that the marketplace of ideas can function if we learn the rules of formal logic to stop the unrationality or the irrationality of the marketplace itself. Such, if we are not sloppy, the best ideas will eventually win because the aggregate person is rational. While I believe that the aggregate person is rational, I don't believe that the aggregate person is rational enough that this is going to happen in the context of a debate. But that might give us a reason to still do them, because two, Uh, while unsolicited advice, Joe Foley believes that the marketplace of ideas is actually a theater. It's not about what idea is best, but which wasn't packaged most effectively for a public audience. We do expose the audience to ideas which they must confront on their own and in their own solitude when they're not feeling the social pressures, or they feel social pressures in a different way. These arguments may arise and have helpful. Lebrano and thus Burns believe that the marketplace of ideas is a commodified trap, teaching us into consuming or explaining ideas in a very banking concept of ideas, and that this is the same as changing the world, leading to passive engagement rather than material action. I talk about this all the time. Podcast is not politics. That's what I mean. But I would say that the embodiedness of politics and doing stuff together and building trust and socially thinking and thinking between multiple people will still involve debate. It's the context of the debate, whether it's performative or not, that matters, not the debate itself. And again, if you're going to bypass the effects of stress coming from the amygdala, this is about trust that you often get by dealing with people in a long time, but dialogue and debate contextualized and embodied through dialogue and through action does make this still possible, of which you could bring to a formal debate or podcast setting. I find that Ben's advice actually works best in more deliberative elements, like you are participating in a policy debate or a union debate, where their Robert's Rules of Order are in tow, and you have an agenda of which you all basically agree, but you're debating the finer points of how to get there. And the goal of intellectual rigor and building a public record of the truth is also confined, not within entertainment, not within this abstract notion of building something better, but in a specific goal that has very socially confined ways. Now, that does not mean one should not do public debate, because I agree with Foley that in the public sphere, particularly on podcasts and YouTubes and shit like that, streams, your goal is to spark curiosity and to provide a way in for people who aren't experts. Your goal is to give people the tools to decide it for themselves, but that means that super highly charged debates are debates on technical expertise against lay people are kind of a waste of time. And I also agree with Lebruno and Burns that the performative nature of debate is particularly deleterious when dealing with, say, people you know online are in massive arenas. But if your goal is to maintain social bonds and collective actions to deliberate, Lebruno and Burns, I just made them LeBurn, like LeBurn and cereal. Like that's not a person. Here. Will lead you to make pretty big errors in reasoning. And what you should do is generally abstain from debates where you don't know that there's a lot of neutral public that could be useful to being exposed to the ideas. So debating highly charged people in very charged environments where people are coming to support very specific people is not probably the best way to do it. And that you should use social bonds and move towards clear goals and collective action when you can in your private life in those debates, thus contextualizing your debates within the context of things you're doing politically in the world that have an effect. All this is to say, give them an argument, but at the right time. I'd like to thank my patrons. Remember, you can like and subscribe, hit the bell, find more, leave a comment if you want to help me out. Behind the Patreon, you can get access for as little as $4. And honestly, if you ask me, I'll give you my Patreon for free. But there's reading groups you can participate in. There's additional shows per month. I do less of them than I used to. There's my entire archive of thousands of shows, both for this channel, some of which is not available in public, and for almost every other show I've done, including Systematic Redness, Vulgar Materialism, Mortal Science, Pop the Left, the seasons 1 and 2 that I was involved in. You can find these things and more behind the Patreon wall. I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting me, and particularly our 2 highest tier patrons, of which I have a new one, and thus need to make an a shout out. I'd like to thank my new Connor Kahanen, our $10 patron, who has the following somewhat absurd name. Cockney Spectre Transvestigator in Chief. I suppose this person is British, but I am not gonna actually confirm that. Thank you, Cockney and Transvestigator, for your support. If you don't have $4 a month, I totally understand. The economy is rough in a lot of places. I'd be happily take your engagement here with comments, spread the word, share, and if you listen to the podcast, the free podcast where all the audio video, all the audios go about a week to a month after we do them here. Leave me reviews on Spotify and Apple Music and all that rot. Have a great day. Protect your peace and debate carefully and with some context.